One interesting idea has been for many years that kids are substantially in a major disadvantage when they exercise in the heat, and their ability to dissipate heat is significantly less than the ones of adults. So let's discuss this topic and see what the literature shows. So we'll talk a little bit about thermoregulation in children and show you some of the older data, some of the new concepts, and some suggestions for the future. So looking at and the data published in the area of temperature regulation in adults versus children and youth, you will very quickly understand that there is almost nothing really published in the area. You see data that I've taken from a 2008 paper and I have updated with some newer data, but you can see the amount of subjects in the youth category is substantially smaller. And most of the stuff that we know, it's based on extrapolations from data from adults. One of the first studies that was published in 1977 from Barbara Drinkwater, who recently passed away actually, she compared 5 girls with 5 collegial students during exercise in 3 different environments. So she did testing in 28 degrees C, 35 degrees C, and 48 degrees C in different environmental conditions. And he made them walk in the treadmill at 30% of the VO2 max, of their equivalent VO2 max values. So just very quickly, just to show you their characteristics, that they were, of course, different due to the age difference. But I think the most interesting data were here, that they show that heart rate for the young girls was significantly higher in all different environments. You can see walk recovery sequence that they were doing. Then they presented some data on cardiac index, and they showed that younger women had significantly lower cardiac index in the 3 different temperatures from 28 to 48 degrees Celsius. Stroke index was also lower. Skin temperature was higher for the younger girls. And evaporation seems to be evaporative heat loss that was calculated. It seems to be lower in some temperatures for the younger girls. So the data were a little bit inconsistent. However, based on this data, Dr. Drinkwater suggested that younger girls seems to be less effective in regulating body temperature in the heat. So one of the things that we know about differences between young versus older kids is that the younger kids might be more predisposed in the heat just because they have greater body surface area to body mass ratio. So there are some known morphological changes, differences between younger kids and adults. So let me show you this diagram so you'll get a little bit of an idea. As you can see here, body surface area, it's greater for a kid, and also the distribution, the size of the head, for example, in proportion to the rest of the body is different for babies, and that thing changes all the way up to adulthood. But there are some differences, and these morphological differences could play a role. So in general, we know that the body surface area for youth is greater per kilogram of body weight when you compare youth versus older adults. Or when you compare to adults, actually, not older adults necessarily. And that could be an advantage when ambient temperature is below skin temperature. So you might have better, what we call dry heat loss. So because of that, when your body can dissipate with greater body surface area, you can lose through convection more heat and through radiation supposedly. But when the ambient temperature is above skin temperature, then that might induce greater dry heat gain. So you might end up gaining more through radiation or through convection when the environmental temperature is above skin temperature. Also, if we think on a topic that we don't talk that much, which is temperature regulation in a cold environment, in cold environment or in cold water immersion, kids might be more prone to become hypothermic and lose heat very quickly. Another thing that we know is that kids have to have greater metabolic heat production because they tend to be less effective during exercise. So they have what we call lower exercise economy, so they use more oxygen per body mass for doing any type of activity compared to adults. So that might have greater energy costs, so more oxygen consumption, so more heat production. However, in the real world, kids do not exercise in the same intensity as adults, and it seems that their intermittent type of way of exercising that they typically do, they seem that lower exercise economy might indeed show some small differences in their ability to regulate temperature. Another thing that we know is that kids seem to sweat a little bit less than adults, and that lower sweating rate might be an issue as far as their efficiency in regulating body temperature. In a different study, they examined the thermoregulatory responses to exercise in a heat environment in prepubertal boys and young adults and older adults. These are some characteristics of this study, and I wanted to draw your attention at something that many studies have been doing. So they compare the different groups to normalize for same percentage of VO2 peak. So they took all the three groups at 52%, around 50% VO2 peak. So yes, they normalize in the same relative exercise intensity. However, if you see here the absolute amount of work that they were doing expressed in power, their power was 40 watts, 111 watts here, and 42 watts. So the young and old groups, they were doing a completely different amount of work. And even when you compare it per kilogram of body weight, you can see that was about 1.4, over 1.5, and 0.55. So when we say that the heat amount that you produce is related to how much, what is the exercise intensity, and even if you look at their O2 uptake, which is also different here, 0.79, 193, and 0.97 during exercise, the stimulus is different even though they normalize for percent of VO2 peak. So anyway, let's look at the data. They showed that for the older adults, the temperature was significantly lower, the core temperature, and for the adults, their core temperature was significantly higher compared to the boys. But we have to keep in mind that the grown-ups had higher core temperature, but they were doing much greater exercise power output. So they were doing almost double the power output compared to the kids. So it is normal to have more metabolic heat production and as a response greater core temperature, which is, in my opinion, it's a major flaw for this study. Regardless, some of the things that they wanted to present, they presented that sweat rate was significantly lower in the kids. However, this is an interesting point. They said that sweating efficiency, so how much they were sweating per power output, they saw that the kids had greater sweating as a response to the power output stimulus. So that was, they report this data as greater sweating efficiency. And they try to explain that based on a theoretical approach where they said because the kids sweat less and they have smaller droplets and more diffusely spaced sweat droplets, those could be easier evaporate and have a greater cooling effect versus adults that they had larger droplets. Those might collapse together and provide less cooling than smaller droplets. So this is something very interesting. We don't have many data in this topic just to look at these differences. A colleague of mine from engineering and I, we receive an NSF grant actually, and we're working on this topic, and we're trying to see differences between size of droplets and look in the mechanism how the sweat gets evaporated. So more recently, Thomas Rowland and colleagues, they study boys and men as far as their ability to regulate heat. They use 65% of the VO2 peak in two different temperatures. And they were looking primarily at exercise tolerance. This is children in a cold weather, adults in a cold temperature, children in the heat, and adults in the heat. And what they showed that in both environmental conditions, there were no statistical differences in their exercise tolerance. And here are some of the characteristics in those two categories. They have data on cardiac index, arterial pressure, etc. So it seems that there are some differences between kids and adults. We have greater body surface area to body mass ratio for children. We have greater heat production per kilogram of body weight for kids compared to adults. It seems that we have lower sweat rate. We have less efficient heat dissipation in a hot environment, in very hot environment, and especially when the temperature is above skin temperature. We have higher risk in a cold environment that we didn't discuss much, and we don't have so many data in this topic. So the bigger question, do we have a greater risk of hyperthermia or heat-related illnesses in kids? So to summarize, it seems that there are some small differences in kids versus adults in thermoregulation, but probably not as much as we thought a few years ago. Definitely there is a great opportunity to study this topic. We don't know that much. There are not too many studies in children, and I think we lack critical studies that they are taken into account equal ways to compare kids and adults, taking into account, for example, absolute metabolic heat production and not just giving a flat given percentage of VO2 max and trying to compare kids and adults when the metabolic heat production, the stimulus for increasing body temperature and in sweating, is not equally balanced. So lots of opportunities, and these are some good ideas if you want to do potentially your thesis or do some studies in this topic. Thank you.